Welcome, people, to today's special webinar. We are very excited for the event today. This is an exclusive webinar for bail for immigration detainees. And briefly, before we start, I would like to give you some information about this important project. Now, many of us will know already that Britain does not have a limit on how long people can be detained in immigration cases. Generally, between 20 and 30,000 people across the span of the year are detained on immigration cases in this country. In the United States, where detention of human beings is a booming private business, it is said that at any point, around 30,000 people are held in indefinite immigration detention. The current cabinet we have here, which happens to be the most diverse in British history, found its kindred spirit in the Trump administration, where children are caged and ICE stands accused of sterilizing migrants. France, in contrast, has a limit of 32 days for people held on immigration cases, while Germany has a limit of 6 weeks. Now, it is safe to say, while this country does not have anything like the jungle camp in Calais, though that is related to British border policy, in terms of detention of migrants, this country has a closer policy to Australia or the United States, where there is no time limit on detention. As someone who worked as a translator in Calais on cases to bring minors to this country to reunite with their family through the Dubs Amendment in EU law, I am deeply worried about the future of immigration policy post-Brexit. The graveyard at the bottom of the Mediterranean and the 30,000 plus people who have died trying to enter Europe over the last few decades speak to the horrific reality of Frontex and the callous indifference of EU policy towards people fleeing war. However, with harsher immigration policy depicted as panacea by many in mainstream media and politics, my fear is more needless suffering and trauma for more people post-Brexit, especially as Priti Patel toys with an Australia-inspired detention island plan for those seeking asylum. This is why I believe it is vital to support this campaign. Those who are detained in prison due to open immigration cases following a custodial sentence are disadvantaged going into their proceedings. Their ability to access legal advice is significantly harder. In many cases, people serve their sentence only to be told right at the last minute by the Home Office that they must now be held indefinitely for immigration reasons. This cold and inhumane treatment by the Home Office leads to traumas, self-harm, and even, in some cases, suicide. It is for all of those reasons that I am excited to join this campaign in demanding bail for all immigration detainees and an end to indefinite detention. Now, on that subject, we are joined today by Dr. Maya Goodfellow, a writer, researcher, and academic. She's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Statesman, Al Jazeera, and The Independent. She is an alumni, like myself, of SOAS, the University of London, where she did her PhD, and she is a trustee of the Runnymede Trust. Thank you for joining us today, Maya. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me and for hosting.
No problem at all. So to start with, we're here to talk about your brilliant book, which I've now read, Hostile Environment. Thank you for that. I think I read a previous edition of it that did not have the new chapter referencing some of the events of this year. But David Lammy, in his review of this book, called it a radical manifesto. Now, David, being someone who voted for the Iraq War, who voted for the war in Libya, who voted for the war in Syria, and who did not vote against the spy cops legislation that was passed by the British government recently, being radical is not actually that difficult when you compare it to that kind of track record. However, what you lay out is a kind of framework for ending the hostile environment, closing down detention centers, and going as far as reforming curriculums and increasing legal aid. If you were able to talk us through this journey that you went on from the micro to the macro, because it's a very wide spanning book where you focus on some of the details of this policy and then you look at some of the larger aspects of it. Could you please talk us through that process?
Yeah, sure. I suppose for those of you that haven't read the book, it's probably worth saying that what it's trying to do is sort of situate the contemporary hostile environment, which is the policies that were brought in through the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts that I imagine quite a lot of you are familiar with, not least because of the so-called Windrush scandal. But trying to contextualize that in Britain's broader and longer history of anti-immigration politics and racism and discrimination, and really trying to understand that Britain's been a hostile environment, I mean, not only for the past 40, 50 years, much longer, but really trying to get to grips with some of this contemporary anti-immigration sentiment. And whilst exploring all of that, I suppose I spent quite a lot of time thinking about what needed to change. And the way that I sort of see it is that you can sort of roughly divide it up between the longer and the shorter term changes that you can advocate for and work for. And I don't think trying to strive for one means that you don't also do the other. So in your introduction, you were talking about a time limit on detention. Obviously that is something to work towards, but to me, it's then the next step is to end detention altogether. And so there's a number of policies I think that we can think about that are sort of, that will change the existing system. And we shouldn't ignore how harmful and violent the existing system is. So changing some of those things, like reducing immigration fees, ending detention, or at least introducing a time limit, doing things like increasing legal aid and making the system is sort of set up to be so incredibly hostile. Trying to advocate for those things and push for those changes will have an impact on people's lives. So we shouldn't ignore how important that is. But relatedly, what you were also talking about in relation to thinking about Frontex and the kind of bordering that goes on both at Britain's borders, but also at Europe's borders, and then obviously internally within the country, in countries and within that the European bloc. I think we also want to sort of flip the narrative so that although I wrote a book about immigration and the immigration debate, actually what we should be talking about is bordering and the violence that is done by borders and how we might begin to unpick that. So not just advocating for changing the existing system, but advocating for undoing bordering and undoing borders and these processes that sort of go on. And I guess this is to do with, related to the fact that the way that borders are framed in the public discourse is that they are necessary for safety. And I think we should be really questioning whose safety, because we see that borders are violent, that people die trying to cross borders, but also the immigration systems. I mean, if anyone can correct or can give me a counter to this, I'm really happy to hear it, but I understand immigration systems as inherently discriminatory. You can change the forms of discrimination that they enact, but they are going to be discriminatory in some form. So I think imagining this world or striving for this world in which we undo that and abolish that is also really necessary. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but making sure enough energy is spent on both, I guess.
I think also what's interesting about your book is you touch on the connection between the building of empire and the demarcating of space in other places. So for example, Gurminda Bambra, who you also quote in the book, someone who I am a big fan of, she put it this way: Britain didn't have an empire, Britain was an empire. Now, in order for people to understand that, they would have to have in the curriculum set out the idea that occupying 13 million miles of the planet leads to people around the world having a relationship with the metropole, even if the metropole only has a directly economic relationship with those places as captive markets, as human resource and as natural resource. So using that way of looking at it, Afghanistan is a place that has been invaded and occupied by the British 3 to 4 times over the past 200 years. So you have somebody like David Goodhart, who me and Gurminda actually debated one day, who put forward, the idea, as you quote in the book, that 100,000 Afghans coming into the country is different from 100,000 Australians. But then if you take into account that the Durand line that was drawn between Afghanistan and India, that all of the policies that Britain had in Afghanistan that really determined the fate of so many people in so many ways, somebody in Afghanistan has a right to consider and call themselves British as somebody living in Kent, really. In real terms, though, it's not really playing out like that. And I think that one of the great things about the book is you marry that micro to the macro by looking at individual stories like Athmar Rasul Muhammad, who was somebody who I also spoke about in a song of mine, whose story deeply touched me. You look at those micro things and you marry them to the macro. Why was it that you focused on those individual stories, and what were the common themes that emerged when looking at those stories?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I suppose there's a number of different reasons, but evidently in this sort of debate and the way that this is immigration is talked about in contemporary politics is the humanity. I mean, it seems like such an obvious thing to say, but I do think it's worth stating is that the humanity is in people's humanity is entirely stripped out from this understanding of why people move and who people are. And so some of the cases and some of the sort of accounts that I wrote about is to do with people who have tried to cross borders and have died trying to do so, and all the many reasons why people might try to make these journeys. And part of the issue is that in the immigration debate, you have these figures like the figure of the economic migrant or the figure of the bogus asylum seeker that totally turn people into these sort of these stereotypes that are often based on a very British sort of dichotomy between the strivers and the skivers. So the people who are greedy or out for what they can get, and the people who are hardworking and should be able to access rights. And so we sort of see these stereotypes perpetuated in the debate. And what is so often lost is how people are impacted by the system. And although I don't think this would necessarily shift the whole debate, what the so-called Windrush scandal showed us is that when certain people in the UK are confronted with what the realities of the immigration system are, they don't necessarily think it's always good. And so, like I said, I don't want to overstate that point, because I think there are some people who think it's still necessary, but I do think there's something about showing how damaging the system is that is really, really important without turning people into sort of passive victims. And one of the things that I learned from interviewing people who tried to like navigate the system is loads of different things, but one of the most obvious things was just the sense of just being treated so badly. And so multiple people said to me, I feel like the government is trying to make the system so hostile to make me leave so that I will just give up, because they make you jump through all these hoops, they make you spend all this money, there's this culture of sort of suspicion and mistrust. And that debate, that macro debate, it does filter down into the structures, so into these things that the people are having to encounter on a daily basis. And so the government says things like, oh, there isn't a target for deporting people, but when you have this sort of macro debate saying there's too many people in the country, we need to lower immigration numbers, then obviously this thinking is going to seep down into governmental structures, into some of these parts of public services that people are interacting with. But I also think it is worth saying, because this is something that a few people really stressed to me, is as much as there is this hostility and the horrible forms of treatment, there have also been many people also talked about the people who sort of supported them or worked with them. So not in a sort of charitable way, but in a solidaristic way, which is really important, I think, to stress, which shows us, I think, that this idea that it's inevitable that people are going to hate immigration and that people can't get along with people over these like sort of constructed lines of difference that like government often talks about, that solidarity shows us that isn't the way that it has to be, that other world sort of is possible, and that some people are like trying to create it in this incredibly hostile and unfair system and country that we're living in.
I think quite an important line that you do draw is, even at the time of the arrival of the Windrush, you had quite a serious contingency within the Labour Party who were deeply opposed to it. You point at David Blunkett, you know, that line running really straight from there to David Blunkett and others that are currently in important positions within the Labour Party. But, you know, what is interesting to me is the way in which this inflation kind of narrative gets pushed out there. You've got only 0.18% of the population in this country are refugees. Now, if they do have recourse to public funds, it's something like £37 per week, and that breaks down to about £5 a day. When you look at Priti Patel, for example, she was being paid £1,000 an hour as an advisor to Viasat. Now, they just happen to be the company that works on systems for Royal Navy warships. Now, those are just two pieces of information. I'm not saying that she would have an interest in militarizing the policing of borders, but that's an interesting relationship. You look at David Goodhart, for instance, Policy Exchange, they are an opaquely funded think tank. You look at Migrant Watch, it's not clear who funds them. A lot of the arguments put forward, the effect that they do have is vertical solidarity and horizontal blame, whereby somebody who suffers the consequences of tens of billions of pounds being cut from the NHS directs their anger at this situation towards the person who's sitting next to them in the waiting room in the hospital, who has a name that they might not be able to pronounce, rather than George Osborne. So it's that horizontal blame, and then implicitly there's the vertical solidarity with George Osborne. Why do you think, when it is something that is, as you demonstrate in the book, which is so clearly not backed up by data and evidence, why does it seem to have such traction with people? Is it because it's so well funded? Is it because they can continuously pump out these headlines? Is it because, as you also point out in the book, the major newspapers are only too ready to doorstep somebody who just happens to be a recipient of £5 a day from the state and who's just about getting by?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of different factors that sort of feed into this production of anti-immigration politics, and then this sort of production of anti-immigration sentiment. And one is something that we've sort of already touched upon a bit, but thinking about how this thinking is historically rooted. So although things have obviously changed in certain ways since Britain formerly had an empire, we do, you know, when people talk about neocolonialism, we can sort of trace these forms of racialization that have shifted, but that still exist within the debate. And so what you find when you look at the debates from the 60s and 70s is so much of what is being said now, or what has been said in the past 10 or 20 years, was being said then. The groups of immigrants that are marked out as a problem might change. And that's sort of unsteady as well in the contemporary debate. Different groups will be switched out for other groups depending on how it's framed, but we can really trace this history to these sort of colonial hierarchies of race that, as I say, the way it's constructed does shift, but we can still trace that racism in the debate. And for me, that was such a big part of understanding the immigration debate, because it's such a sort of commonplace phrase in politics now to say, you know, it's not racist to be concerned about immigration. And this, if you suggest that we can locate racism in the debate anywhere, you're sort of cast aside as someone who doesn't care what normal people think about immigration, totally ignoring, you know, those of us who don't hold those views, totally ignoring all those migrants who are working class, because this is often constructed as a sort of class thing. But the other thing that I think has really driven this or has sustained it is something, again, that you suggested in the question, which is that this has been reproduced, this thinking has been reproduced and articulated by the party political left and right. And so in this history of anti-immigration politics, you find Labour governments and Conservative governments enacting incredibly racist immigration legislation, incredibly restrictive immigration legislation. You know, the trade union movement, large parts of that come out very badly from that history as well, sort of buying into this idea that immigration is bad for working class people, will undercut wages and take jobs. And you find those debates in the early 1900s that are very anti-Semitic, so directed towards Jewish migrants in particular. But I think in that, one of the things that I think is worth noting, because it's sort of something that I'm maybe semi like obsessed with thinking about, is that New Labour is a really good example of this. The way that it's been written in it recently is that the reason that anti-immigration sentiment went up under New Labour, and we ended up with this rise of UKIP and eventually Brexit, that there's this thinking that is sort of fed into this by letting too many people into the country. And what that totally ignores is that New Labour were anti-asylum almost immediately they come into office, and they are saying horrendous things about people who are seeking asylum. They're then implementing incredibly restrictive legislation. And so some of you will know that there's a campaign now that for people who are seeking asylum to be given the right to work, and whilst their asylum application is being processed. It was New Labour that really tried to take away those rights of work. And so that is so often ignored in the debate, and it's just assumed that it's sort of natural, that people dislike immigration. But I think looking at the way the politicians, the legislation they enact, the things that they say, shows us how it's being produced. And yeah, finally, as you say, is the press and large sections of the media sort of reproducing some of this thinking. And I've been reading a lot of Stuart Hall recently, and I've been thinking a lot about how the way that it is sort of so deeply embedded is a form of common sense. So it may not be true, but it seems true. So it seems accurate to people. And because it's historically rooted in this way that I've talked about, this sort of common sense thinking that immigration is bad for the economy or bad for British culture is quite readily accepted, and at times unwittingly reproduced by, many times actively done by parts of the media, but at times just also unwittingly it sort of ends up structuring the debate, because it's assumed, oh well, people must dislike immigration because it's a threat to their culture. And again, the groups of migrants that are seen to be the cultural threat are racialized. So I think it's sort of this web, unfortunately, this horrendous web, and this historical build-up that I think allows the debate to be sustained in the way that it is.
I think also, to get to the Sivan Anden argument of we are here because you were there, rather than the economic argument, you need the education around the British Empire and around colonialism to happen before that, as a sort of precursor. And because that hasn't happened within our society, unfortunately, and because we've had Operation Legacy, which you also mentioned but not directly, in the book, Operation Legacy really has been carried out not just as a burning of colonial documents happening within British government. I feel like that Operation Legacy process is played out in terms of the education system and other things like that. What I find really interesting is the sort of contradictory stances that can be taken in terms of foreign policy, because you have Boris Johnson coming out and inviting people from Hong Kong to come to Britain, and there being zero kickback from the media in that regard. What's also interesting is the case of Jimmy Mubenga, who was suffocated and put into what they called the flying carpet position on a chartered flight by G4S guards carrying out a deportation, and he was heard asking for help on the flight, and he died really during that process. Now, what was interesting is when it came out, they were found not guilty of manslaughter, but afterwards evidence of racist text messages were found on the phones of the guards concerned, and that evidence, as far as I understand, was deemed inadmissible and could not be included in the court case, unfortunately. But how is it that a company like G4S, which has literally so much scandal connected to its name, how is it able to continually win major contracts?
Yeah, I think that this is sort of where we really get to thinking about capitalism and the money that is made from bordering and from sort of managing migration, as it's often talked about by government. And there is, to me, it does come down to the normalization of bordering forms of border control, and people thinking that they are sort of...
Sorry, just to interrupt you very quickly. So sorry, Maya. So sorry. Also, I forgot to mention that you are welcome to ask questions to Dr. Maya Goodfellow and myself if you want. The Q&A icon should be below. But go ahead, Maya. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I think like really when we're thinking about the normalization of border control, there is this sort of assumption that either these things that happen are often done by whether it is these private corporations or whether it is immigration officials or police, that these are sort of unhappy accidents instead of sort of quite predictable or predictable outcomes of a system that attempts to treat people, that tries to treat people in these particular ways. And I often think of Joy Gardner, her case is not particularly well known in the UK, aside from, I think, in particular circles. When I've talked about the book prior to the pandemic and prior to lockdown, I would talk about what happened to Joy Gardner and ask, room full of people, how many of you know of Joy Gardner, have heard about what happened to Joy Gardner? And there's so few people often, and that is exactly the education system you're talking about. It's a damning indictment of that education system that we aren't taught about what happened. Joy, for those of you who don't know, was someone who was quite a complicated, long history, but had come to the UK. Her mother had moved to the UK from Jamaica and had the right to come here because Britain had an empire as a citizen, as those people who were involved in the Windrush scandal also did. But when Joy Gardner tried to join her mother, the successive pieces of legislation had been introduced by Labour and Conservative governments that were implicitly racist, trying to stop people of colour coming from the former colonies. And Joy was impacted by that, but tried to come to the UK anyway, did so, had family here. All of her family were here. She had a child here. And then the government were trying to deport her. And one morning in 1993, a load of police and immigration officials turned up at her house, totally with no warning. She thought another sort of appeal to stay in the country was being considered. Her lawyers hadn't been told because the government later admitted that they didn't want them to know beforehand that this was going to happen. So she had no legal advice beforehand, didn't know this was going to happen. And then she was suffocated by these immigration officials and police, and she was bound so tightly that her brain was starved of oxygen. And there's never been like nothing ever really happened. All the people who were, I think, put on trial were acquitted, and that isn't a case that is well known. And I realize that sounds like a bit of a detour, but actually I think that in order to hold companies like G4S accountable, we need to get to grips with this recent history. We need to get to grips and understand the forms of violence that are being produced by these companies, and really start to think differently about how we want to structure our world, and recognizing that these companies that make huge amounts of money from doing this kind of bordering are endangering people's lives. People are dying at these borders, and there are these instances like Jimmy Mubenga where people are killed. And I think that needs to sort of drive the debate. Instead that the reverse logic is that these companies are necessary for safety, but as I said at the start, they're producing forms of violence. And I think, to me, this is tied up with economic justice arguments. And so when the left is talking about economic equality, we can't only think about the UK, we need to think globally. And when we are thinking about the UK, we need to include in everyone, so that be that undocumented migrants, people who have documentation but weren't born in this country, and think about what economic justice would mean for them. And it would mean not having to interact with these private corporations that do things like run asylum housing but leave people to live in houses that are rat infested or really poor quality. Like, look at that as part of the economic justice argument. So it's not see immigration as something that is separate, but it's something that is rooted in that debate.
And just quickly before we go to questions from the audience, we now exist in a time where, because of COVID, you've seen remittances that are being sent to the global south decrease by 28%. So if you have a country like Haiti or South Sudan, where over 30% of their GDP comes from remittances, or a country like Nigeria, for instance, where 24 billion each year is sent back in remittances, or Egypt, where 27 billion each year is sent back in remittances, you are, as these crises that we are seeing brought about, not just health crises, but also climate crisis becomes more and more intense, you're going to see the movement of people across the world to places which are safe. But also on top of that, you have seen a massive swelling of people mobilizing against unaccountable power. When we look at the death of George Floyd in the United States and what that sparked and kind of became a fulcrum for. You deal, as I understand, in the latest edition of the book, with the connections between this year and the events of this year and immigration debate, and also how the borders are being enforced. What is the connection between the events this year and the debate around immigration?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things, and firstly, I would probably just say, because the new edition, this new chapter is really about the impact of immigration enforcement as well. It's as well about the impact of immigration enforcement during the pandemic, and so it's just really quickly worth noting that whilst we have the second partial lockdown, there are people, because of their immigration status, who are scared to access healthcare during a pandemic. One of the things that we should all the time, one of the things that we should have automatic access to is healthcare. But under the hostile environment, people have been made scared to go to their local GP or their hospital. And so the government did say that they would charge people for going to get tested for coronavirus. But after 10 years of hostility, really, in our public services, quite explicitly being articulated, put on the side of vans and really, really proudly declared by government, there wasn't a suspension of the hostile environment in its entirety, which the government could have done and should have done to make people feel that they could access healthcare. And many people don't have any financial support. So if you're undocumented and you are need to be shielding but can't, because you have to go out and work, because if you don't go out and work, then you won't have any support from the state. And there have been some instances of examples of people risking their lives to go out and work. And obviously this isn't only people who have particular immigration status, but there's all kinds of specific vulnerability depending on your immigration status. But also people being too scared to go to their hospital or GP and contracting coronavirus. And so I think that, that is really, really important to understand what's going on at the moment. But there is, I think, also this real positivity in how the horrendous murder of George Floyd and, the murder of so many African Americans in the US has produced this sort of the biggest anti-racist protest this country has ever seen. Like, there's parts of the country that I have heard about where there's like small villages where there's been protests in support of Black Lives Matter, which I think really matters. And I think one of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement does, which is one of the many important things that it does, is force people to begin to question the things that they assumed were necessary. And so for a good example is defund the police. That demand, despite being dismissed by the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, that demand is being, a lot of people are hearing that for the first time and seriously engaging with this thinking, this more abolitionist thinking. And so for me, I think that should also include thinking about our borders and what that means, and this other world that we can imagine is possible, that isn't only tweaking around with the existing system that I talked about at the start, but is imagining that much more expansive world. So I think that is really, really important. But the one thing I would just very quickly say before we go to questions is the one example of how in the UK we can take inspiration from that abolitionist thinking and be better with this whole debate is the immigration health surcharge, which was in the news majorly during the first lockdown. There were campaigners and the Labour Party were saying it should be suspended for people who work in the NHS and who are care workers. And the surcharge, for those of you that don't know, although I'm sure a lot of you do given that debate, means that people who have it applied to them because of their immigration status have to pay twice over for the NHS. So they pay in through their national insurance and tax like the rest of us, and then they pay again. And it's just gone up to over £600 per year per person. The campaign during the first lockdown successfully meant that it's been scrapped for NHS workers and care workers, but everyone else still has to pay. And to me, that shows the problem with an immigration, a sort of campaign that treats some people as good and productive and necessary and other people as less important or not productive or not necessary, which is what the points-based system does. It's what the sort of contributions narrative does in the immigration debate. And so the immigration health surcharge should be abolished for everyone, And I think that should sort of make us recognize or think in a more expansive way that when we're thinking about rights, we should be thinking about rights for everyone, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of their job, regardless of their salary, regardless of where they're from. Everyone should have decent rights, not just the people who are deemed to be somehow more productive.
Yeah, I think interesting on the point of no recourse to public funds. I remember when Boris Johnson was asked at one of the press conferences about a family who were in that situation. And we're talking about estimated 1.4 million people in this country out of a population of about 66 million people. 1.4 million people have gone through the lockdown with no recourse to public funds. And as far as I remember, last estimates about undocumented workers in London was around 200,000 people. So we're talking about quite a lot of people that have really had to struggle through this period, and how they've survived, I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I'm going to take a few of the questions from the audience. So one of them, and this is an interesting one, could you see a way for the UK to move away from the privatization of the asylum system when there are so many Tory MPs with personal links to these companies like G4S and Serco? Is this a problem only with the Tory party, or is it relevant to the Labour Party too?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I guess there's two things. I think that you're right, that in sort of the phrasing of that question, it seems very unlikely. They do have vested interests in this system. It is not just I mean, it's ideological as well as being something that it's like linked to the stuff around Grenfell and all those Tories who have an interest in making sure that tenants don't have a right and maintaining landlords' really, really horrendous rights that impact so badly on people who are tenants. I think there is that, and there is that part of it that I think makes it seem like change is not possible. And I don't want to be, I mean, I'm sort of naturally a pessimist, but I don't think, I would hazard a guess to say that the immigration system is not going to get better generally under the Conservatives. I would sort of guess that that's this case. I hope that there's some sustained pressure will change that. But I think that is the other point, is the campaigning and changing what that common sense is that I talked about. So changing how people think about this and what they think is acceptable is one of the important things to do here, because unfortunately, although there is an ideological drive from parts of our political from all of our political class, but just different ideological drives, there is power and importance in sustained public pressure and campaigning around these things. So like I say, I think a change to the asylum system under this government is very unlikely, the sort of change you're talking about, and I think it would be difficult under a next government if it was Labour, but I don't think it's necessarily impossible, and it's something that can be produced in the longer term, I guess, if there's campaigned and sustained pressure around it. It's not necessarily that positive an outlook, but I do think it's important to continue to press on these issues, because you can change sort of public thinking on this too.
I mean, I think also as people that work with a project like Bail for Immigration Detainees, they'll be very aware, keenly aware, that victories are often attritional in their nature when dealing with something the size of this. You know, and I think of the case of Ahmed al-Sadiq, who was an Iraqi PhD student in Sheffield, who following ISIS invading Mosul, wanted to, following the death of his father, wanted to claim for asylum in England. But what happened to him was, through the process of doing his PhD and a mix on the side of the Home Office, he was detained in Morton Hall. Now, that year at Morton Hall, there have been 4 suicides already. But after a mobilization of people online, of academics within Sheffield University, of students around his case, the pressure was applied to the Home Office that forced his release from Morton Hall. So I think that it's also important, as much as learning about how the borders came to be shaped in the way that they are, it's also important for us to lift up and also as important as it is to focus on those cases of Jimmy Mubenga and Ahmad Rasul Muhammad and others, and the people that are very much victim to this process, it's also about focusing on the victories that are won in an nutritional way. Are there any victories that you would like to point out, even anecdotally, that you think contain lessons for those of us looking to push forward on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the although the system is still very bad, one of the best that I can think of is when the new Labour government wanted to introduce a voucher system, so the people who were had their asylum application in, were waiting on their asylum application to be processed, weren't given any money, but were given vouchers, so that they could take these vouchers to particular shops, but they wouldn't be allowed to be given any change whatsoever. So this sort of underlying notion that these people are untrustworthy ingredients sort of out for what they can get. And there was a campaign that began, I think, I'm going to misremember, I want to say it began in the northeast, but I think that's just because I'm from Newcastle. It began somewhere that wasn't London, and it was begun by people who were impacted and by local support groups, and then it was sort of picked up by the parts of the trade union movement, and then by some backbench Labour MPs, Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, those sorts of backbench MPs who resisted a lot of the new Labour asylum legislation, and they really fought it. And they've successfully fought it. And one of the things that was done during the new Labour years as well, even though I'm sort of, I think there's evident limitations to this, is there were a number of legal challenges. So people went to the courts to stop the government from implementing certain legislation and were at times successful. And so I do think there's a number of routes in terms of resisting. And one of the things that I would say as well, although this obviously can't be done in every single case, but one of the things that the government also don't like is very bad publicity after this, especially anything that sort of is anyway vaguely tied to Windrush that will sort of reignite that a bit. And so you do see a number of instances of people getting quite a lot of media attention or social media attention around their deportation case or unfair treatment within the system, which is obviously so many people. So this is a limited number. And some of those end up, it seems, I mean, I don't work in the Home Office, so I can't say for sure. The way it looks is that sustained pressure then either sort of fast tracks it or forces some kind of decision that doesn't always work. I don't know what's actually going on there, but I always think it's worth, as you say, highlighting these cases, highlighting the fact that people are resisting and doing this for themselves and sort of challenging the system, is just a really important thing to do anyway to support the people who are doing that work.
We also have a question from Fabian McLaughlin, who says, I believe that the way we look at immigration through the lens of security is very dangerous. Have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think, I suppose it depends on the way that you are thinking about that lens of security, because I see that being articulated in a number of different ways, whether that is thinking about people as being sort of positioned or constructed as potential terrorist threat, which is often some of the really Islamophobic discourses around, particularly if you're thinking about Europe more broadly, and if you think about that whole debate, that whole awful debate around people coming from Syria and trying to seek asylum in countries in Europe, and that was very much rooted in this sort of figure of the dangerous refugee who, but in related to that is this sort of idea that certain groups of people, as we've sort of touched on, are culturally distinct or culturally threatening. And you really see this as it's often articulated as an argument around women's rights, which I obviously find so horrendous, given that there's this idea that it's like culturally, there's an inherent cultural difference from people in certain parts of the world where women's rights is not something that they consider. Aside from the fact that that's an incredibly racist argument, it also entirely ignores the forms of misogyny and violence against women within the UK or within Europe. And so there is that problem with the security argument there, but there's also an economic security argument about there being a limited number of resources. And I mean, that's just really patently untrue, given that it sort of is rooted in this idea that there is a limited number, the economy is sort of a container. And so if people come in, it will reduce the number of jobs, totally ignoring that when people come into countries, they spend, they create need, and so therefore they create jobs too, they put into the tax system. But the other thing that should be said about the economic argument, that again is related to what we've talked about in relation to colonialism and thinking about global politics, is if we understand the history of colonialism, what we understand is that Britain's industrial revolution wasn't produced by some kind of innate genius or innate wealth. It was largely powered off of wealth from the colonies and material resources. Like if you think you can understand the industrial revolution without understanding India, then you have a totally incorrect understanding of this country's history, which is, you know, is not something we're taught about. But it's worth sort of tracking how that's shifted. But some of these structures remain in terms of how the global economy is structured. And so I would just very quickly say that Jason Hickel's work shows that there is more coming out of the so-called global south through things like tax evasion, bad trade deals, global corporations sort of not putting money back into countries that they are extracting resources from, than goes in through so-called aid or development spending. And when we look at the world like that, then I think we also should look at the fact that people should be able to move wherever they want, whilst certain countries in the world are sort of sucking up resources for themselves. That isn't to say people are only motivated by economic need entirely, but it is to recognize that there is a global inequality that must be important for how we understand movement. And Asad Rehman, who I interviewed for the book, who's the director of War on Want, said something really interesting, important, I think, to me, which is that people should have the right to move, but they should also have the right to stay if they want. And so that should be in our debate. When we're thinking about the immigration debate, it's not only changing the UK, it is, you know, maybe lofty ambitions, but it is changing the way that our global economy is structured too, and things like the climate crisis that you mentioned, so that people don't have to move if they don't want to.
I mean, also, it seems crude, but I feel I have to respond to it because of the way the question has been posed around security. You will find those pushing the idea that refugees coming into a country will make that country more likely to be at risk of terrorism. Well, what I look at that as a marriage of threat inflations, because on one hand, you have Chris Hunter, expert for the British government on terrorism, who put it that you have in this country 1 in 16 million chance of being anywhere near an act of political violence. When you talk about refugees, you're talking about 0.18% of the country. So you're talking about such an infinitesimal likelihood of anything security related being brought on by a refugee coming to the country. But also more than that, when we look at the cases whereby people's citizenship has been taken away in this war on terror era, the idea being that if a person, you know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm sure there are people that are far more well versed on this than me watching the event today, but the idea that you have some basis upon which you could claim for citizenship of another country, and that can be far removed, that can be a parent, has citizenship of that country, so therefore that is the basis at which your citizenship can be removed, right? They've looked at the cases of people who have had their citizenship removed, with the idea being that they could potentially claim for citizenship elsewhere, and the majority of those people are from countries that have a majority Muslim population. So that could be understood one way. The distribution of this particular law can have a kind of, if not intent, an effect which is almost part of an Islamophobic push, really a structural push. You know, because we're also talking about the half a million people that are estimated to have been stopped under the Schedule 7 Terrorism Act. You know, you're 154 times more likely to be stopped under that act if you are an IC4, which is defined as a Pakistani man by the police. So there are ways in which, you know, you see these policies are all interlinked and related with issues of security. Now, some of the other questions that I will get to, just a reminder that my book is The Hostile Environment. I think you should pick it up. We have some great questions and we have so many. I'm just trying to get a handle on which ones would be good. I mean, I think this is dealt with in the book, but do you think New Labour's immigration policies became more discriminatory post 9/11?
Oh, yes. I mean, New Labour's policies were discriminatory in all kinds of ways anyway. And so there's this sort of, so it is important to think about their war on terror and their incredibly Islamophobic policies, but it's also, so I'll get to that in one moment, but it is also worth sort of recognising that it's quite complicated what New Labour do, but they are sort of pro-economic immigration. But as we're sort of seeing with this government, there's a lot of similarity, although I think this government can make people's rights much worse than they are right now. And it's not the same, but there is a sort of similarity between the way this government's talking about wanting the best and the brightest and the people who do certain work and come in and be able to do certain jobs, and the way that New Labour spoke about it. And what New Labour, I would argue, seemed to sort of try to do was create this stratified system of rights whereby you could come into the country for a particular amount of time if you had certain skills or you could do the right job, and then your path to citizenship would be extended. So they actually, I think it was New Labour that increased the amount of time people had to the path to citizenship from 5 to 10 years. So doing all kinds of things to make people's rights poorer depending on what visa they came in. And so this government, I think the points-based system is, it's not a points-based system in the way that Australia's is, but what it seems to be is making people's rights worse, at least people who are deemed to be like not skilled enough or not rich enough, because there is a class element at the heart of our immigration system. But yeah, what you see with New Labour is they update the Race Relations Act in 2002, and there is a specific clause, I can't remember the wording of it off by heart, but whereby there should still be discrimination on the basis of ethnicity for immigrants. So that's allowed to be essentially racially discriminatory in that way. But it's really tied up with how they sort of construct people who are legally citizens, but they imagine not to be citizens. And so there's sort of this racialized distinction. And you see this a lot with the sort of violence in Oldham in 2001. You see that the way that New Labour react to that is really by saying there were these people, there are what they call Asian youths who don't have come into our home. So the government is sort of talking about this as the people who are inherently British. And these Asian youths have come into our home and been disruptive and like are being culturally different. And so what you see in the history of the debate is this sort of merging so clearly of British citizens, racialized British citizens, and racialized immigrants, non-citizens. And so you sort of see this similarity between at least the way that they're talked about, and then sort of policy flows from that too. And so yes, there is certainly this evident sort of construction of who is deemed to be a threat, sort of shifting with that.
I think there's a really brilliant question here from Chris E, which I think will be really productive to really end on this conversation, to give us something to think about going away. He says, I feel it becomes easy for the media / politicians to victimize asylum seekers because of the lack of social solidarity generally. How do we build inclusive campaigns of social solidarity that have resonance throughout society? And are there any good examples of doing this? And I think that speaks to the point that we were making before about the horizontal blame and vertical solidarity. It's like, if you can adjust that direction of solidarity. And, I think one of the great ways to defeat that is merely by saying to people, look, okay, you've got refugees being 0.18% of the society. Okay. If they have recourse to public funds, it's about £5 a day. Okay. If we look at the numbers and the estimates for people that died due to austerity, Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford University and others put it together that this is prior to COVID-19, you were looking at about 130,000 people dying because of austerity. From a population of 67 million, you are far more likely to die because of austerity than you are to die from something like terrorism or any other scarecrow that is being used to frighten you into seeing people that have far more in common with you as your enemy. I think it's about having those arguments as much as you can. But what would you say, Maya? And also, what examples, there's organizations like Migrants Organize, there's Bail for Immigration Detainees. There was an organization that we ran at SOAS in 2016 where we were organizing students of different languages to go on a convoy to Calais and work on cases with law firms in London, like Bat Murphy and Islington Law Centre and others who were working pro bono to try and help people come over to Britain and reunite with their families. What examples can you give us, Maya, of alternative ways of building solidarity?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and sort of the question, if you like. There is so I'll start with the good stuff, which is that there are organizations all across the country, so you've named a few, that are doing this kind of work, and as I said right at the start, not on the basis of charity but on the basis of solidarity. So really having an anti-racist solidaristic politics at the heart of what these organizations are doing, which I think is incredibly important when we're thinking about something like immigration, where there can be this sort of paternalistic relationship that I think is can be really counterproductive. And so there are organizations, often very small organizations, doing this sort of work. One of the ones that I went to go and visit for part of the research of the book is an organization called Aquaba, which is based in Hackney, which is a Sunday centre for people, regardless of their status, to go to have lunch, to just hang out and chat with people, but also do all kinds of things that are on offer. I think there's things like English classes, yoga classes, there's a children's area. It's such an amazing space. And so just for those of you who are out there who have the resources, it's if you have the money to give to some of these organizations, then I think that is really important in this climate. But also giving the time to them, and so giving your time to these organizations if you can is also really important, particularly over the next few years when this government is likely going to make things a lot worse. But I think that there's two things that I think that are sort of related to this. One is that for me, this is sort of where those liberals who are maybe describe themselves as loosely pro-immigration can maybe be brought on a journey. So a journey of saying, look, it isn't about saying that someone contributes to the economy and therefore their rights should be fought for, or it isn't about saying that you want to give to people who are navigating the immigration system. It is about working together in order to do that. And so I think there's potentially sort of constituents of people that can be won over to this way of thinking or this way of organizing. I'm not saying it's necessarily easy, but in order to sort of expand the number of people doing this work, if that is of interest. I know there's people who maybe just aren't doing this work, who already have that politics, who maybe should be your first port of call. But then I think the other sort of part to that is that I guess you can partly focus on some electoral politics and on pressuring politicians and pressuring the opposition to just be less terrible or less bad than a lot of what they've said recently have been, or less silent around channel crossings, for instance. But I also think that it's not about what the past few years at least has taught me, which I'm sure a lot of you already knew, is that channeling your energies only into party politics, but also channeling them only into sort of elections, is not a way to shift the sort of basis of the debate. And so that kind of organizing is also about having those discussions with people that you live with or you live next door to, and changing the debate in that way. I'm not saying it's going to happen quickly or easily, but I do think having this sort of more spread out and sort of, I guess, a grassroots forms of organizing that change that debate and that challenge this thinking is part of a much bigger puzzle, but a really, really necessary and important part, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maya. And thank you to everybody sending questions. There were so many great ones. Unfortunately, we didn't get the opportunity to deal with your questions. I just want to say before we close up that check out BID Detention on Twitter and support the work that this great organization do. if anyone needs legal advice, then please do go to the website and look at the resources that are available there, and you will find the contact information which will allow you to get in touch. Also, pick up Maya's book, Hostile Environment. Thank you very much to the hosts for having us today, and thank you to Maya for a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Bye.